Hannah, you ready to kick things off?
Yeah, I sure am. We're just letting a number of participants in at the moment, but welcome everybody who has arrived dead on the dot of midday, excited for these recipes for recovery. And as it's midday, I'm sure all our tummies are rumbling and our mouths are watering, waiting to hear more from the case studies that are going to be presenting their business models and work to us today. So we'll just go through the agenda whilst people are still arriving, so you know what is coming up in the hour. First of all, it's this bit, the welcome and introductions to everyone. And then Julia McCarthy from SRUC is going to share a little bit about Anacare, the research project that SRUC has led together with the University of Edinburgh and Royal Botanic Gardens of Edinburgh over the last year. It's been an action research project, so we've been working together with organisations on the ground, and those organisations are represented and here today to tell us their stories. RSPB Scotland, we've got Tasmin and Izzy from the Glencripesdale Reserve, Highlands Rewilding, and a story about their Beldorney estate. We've got Penelope Whitehorn from Highlands Rewilding, and then Leonie, Alexander and Rob from Edinburgh Agroecology Co-op, who run Lauriston Farm. We'll then have opportunities to ask each of the case studies some questions, and then a kind of more together after we've heard from all of the case studies Q&A session, and then we'll wrap up and move on to what's next. So I think that's the agenda covered. I covered some of these intros, but yes, thank you to the project team who's pulled this event together with the support of Julia Clough from Scottish Forum on Natural Capital, and many thanks to you from the Scottish Nature Finance Pioneers Network to come and learn with us. So NERC stands for Natural Environment Research Council, and they have funded this research project. Julia McCarthy, Mark Reed and Eric Jensen have joined in with me from SRUC, and then Marc Metzger from the University of Edinburgh and Chris Ellis from the Royal Botanic Gardens have also been part of the team. And then the case studies I just introduced: Tasmin and Izzy, Penelope and Rob and Leonie. So I think that's all of the intros. We are recording this session. If you don't want to be recorded, keep your camera off and don't say anything out loud. Do put a question in the chat though. We're not going to keep that. And we're going to have opportunities for questions in the agenda. So either hold them to those points or pop them in the chat. All right, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Julia to introduce you to the project. Thanks, Julia.
Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of an introduction to the case studies and the project background. So Anacare is Gaelic for coming together, specifically the two faces of a mountain that meet to form the uniting ridge. So in this case, the two sides of the mountain represent the on-the-ground biodiversity projects that create or generate ecosystem services, and the other side represents the investment that's needed to make these projects possible at scale. And then at the uniting ridge, there are several elements that in this project we think are really important to consider to create high integrity projects and investments. So these include business models, community engagement, and then the common language of data. So the focus of this research project has really been to increase our understanding of what these different elements could look like and to identify some of the challenges, information gaps, and research needs so that we can better integrate biodiversity and nature finance. So our project includes two different pieces. One was the Scottish Nature Finance Pioneers Survey that we conducted last summer. And then the second piece are looking at these three project examples that you're going to hear from today and really kind of diving in to look at how they have approached their business models, community engagement, and ecological data. So we really want to kind of bring these elements together and understand what biodiversity projects look like and what they can look like. So like on the project side, what are ecologists, managers, and project developers doing? What are their business models, engagement efforts, ecological data, and reporting? And then on the investment side for these projects, what are the needs of the funders and the investors? Are they expecting financial returns? And are they looking at community engagement and ecological data elements to inform key performance indicators? So I want to start with just kind of a really broad picture of the landscape and kind of the potential continuums for each of these different three elements that we want to explore in this project. So the three projects that you'll hear from today, as well as just biodiversity projects in general, are really quite diverse. So for example, at a very coarse level, the projects today vary in location, from remote to rural to urban. But despite their different approaches to these different elements, they all have the same aim, which is to improve or restore biodiversity. So kind of looking at business models first, there's a range of options for nature finance. So Hannah calls these the 3 Ps in the pod. So you have public, philanthropic, and private. And there's a lot of differences in these different approaches to funding. So for example, grants or other public funding mechanisms provide public benefits, but not necessarily financial returns. Whereas philanthropy and private investment models often expect some type of return on investment. And this could be either monetary or non-monetary. So things like reputational benefits, ESG programs, and the like. So the second element is, looking at the community of interested parties. And so this could range from, the very local geographic community to a much more global community of interested parties. And so this is, may not only be influenced by the location of a biodiversity project, but also the different funding models that a project might use. So for example, local communities may form really direct connections with a project, but then also you may have national or global fundraising efforts that engage interested parties who may never visit the project site, but it offers a way for people to engage in meaningful biodiversity projects from anywhere globally. And then the third element is looking at kind of the ecological perspective. So here there's also a continuum of, the baseline conditions and the potential for biodiversity improvements. So some sites might be really degraded from historic land uses and thus carry, an ecological debt, while other sites may reflect a more intact ecosystem that's important for conserving or protecting unique habitat species. So where a project lies on these three continuums is going to influence the purpose, the scope, and ultimately the vision for the biodiversity project. So these elements all kind of come together in the planning and development of a project. So each element, and then also the interactions between these elements, is going to influence how the project plays out, the vision, the goals, and the objectives of a project. So from the human perspective, you have individuals and landowners who have their own motivations. You have the interests of funders and investors, and then you also have the interests and concerns of the community of interested parties as well. And these are all going to have the potential to influence the scope and the vision of a project. Another element that we're not going to talk about today, but it has kind of come forward as a result of this project, is also looking at the importance of the international and the national policy context. This is also a really key element that's going to shape kind of the focus and the vision of a project. And then, the other piece here is the ecological perspective. So this is looking at the specific characteristics of a site, its landscape setting, its reference context are going to influence the scope of the project and the restoration potential. So, for example, should something be a grassland or a woodland habitat, is the existing condition degraded or is it relatively pristine? And are there other constraints like adjacent land management that are going to affect the project's potential? So when you look at a project's vision and goals and objectives, this is influenced by all of these elements, right? And then the vision, goals, and objectives then in turn are going to influence the types of data that you need to collect and how you're going to communicate the outcomes. So there may be different needs for data collection and reporting based on the needs that are identified by the community, by the investors or funders, or by the biodiversity objectives and targets themselves. So that's kind of the big picture background to tee up, turning it over to the 3 case study project examples. So you'll hear from our 3 biodiversity projects examples on how they've developed their business models that benefit biodiversity, look at their approach to project planning, setting goals and objectives, how they've collected baseline data, how they're planning to track progress and communicate their outcomes. So with that, I think I turn it over first to Izzy and Tasmin at Glencripesdale Reserve.
Hi there, I'm Izzy. I'm the site manager for our SRUC reserve, so that includes Glencripesdale and Glenborrow. And I'm going to do the first couple of slides for us and then hand over to Tasmin as well. So for those of you that don't know, the RSPB is a conservation charity. It manages a wide range of reserves across the UK and Scotland. These vary massively in habitat type. We also work off reserve on projects and partnerships. And the RSPB also works outside of land management in things regarding like policy and advocacy as well. So Glencripesdale Reserve is a new reserve to us. It was formerly Nature Scots, and the main interest feature for us is Scotland's rainforest. It is really significant in terms of the lichen and bryophyte assemblages that it supports, and also wider biodiversity. It has a lot of potential for restoration. There is a lot of work to do. There's non-native species, there's high herbivore impact, so plenty of work to be done. Our vision is to have a regenerating and expanding rainforest which supports internationally important assemblages of epiphytes and a broad range of biodiversity. But the real vision is actually much greater. Within the Morven landscape and surrounding peninsulas and across the whole of the rainforest priority landscape. So really trying to communicate why rainforest is important and how we can connect with other organisations and initiatives to deliver at true landscape scale. So our business model and sort of main objectives. So the main objective of the partnership with SRUC was to really help build that baseline data at the beginning of the reserve ownership from our point of view. And that data can really help inform decision making and also allow us to monitor the impact that we have as we move through managing the site over the years. So for the initial purchase of the reserve, there was a big fundraising appeal, which helped support the reserve purchase. We also had a major donor appeal and had quite a range of funding that we managed to bring together for the purchase. Moving forwards, we use a mosaic of funding which includes core funding from the RSPB. So that is largely through memberships and fundraising activities. We will also be applying for grants. So FGS is a really important source of funding through for woodland management, non-native species, managing herbivore impact through fencing and that sort of thing. We also can access corporate sponsorship for some projects. Our reserve at Glencripesdale has had some funding through that mechanism as well, which is really valuable. And we also do targeted fundraising for specific projects. So that's kind of the overall what we do. There's obviously challenges in accessing some of these funding sources. There can be quite a lot of time involved in some of these things. So it's not an easy win, but it's definitely worth the effort. Community engagement. So the reserve has its challenges in being very remote. There's no public access by vehicle. So in terms of face-to-face engagement, it's not very feasible at Glencripesdale Reserve, but our other reserve nearby at Glencripesdale is our public face for the RSPB here, and we have a footpath and run guided walks. So in terms of visitor engagement and a lot of the face-to-face that happens at our sister site, but it's really important that we do engage with the local communities through the community councils, through engaging with our neighbours and the deer management group. And we're also managing a landscape scale project on Morven off-site. So that really helps in plugging into other initiatives that are happening and really making sure that we're sort of leading by example at the same time. Yeah, so I think that's a bit of a overview of those, and I'm going to hand over to Tasmin to cover the ecological data.
Thanks, Izzy. Yeah, so I'm Tasmin. I'm the warden at the reserve, working alongside Izzy. So in terms of the ecological data we've collected so far, as Izzy touched on before, our overall goal is to have regenerating expanding rainforest, which supports internationally important assemblage of epiphytes, that is, plants that grow on other plants, such as lichens and mosses, as well as having high rates of biodiversity more broadly. And we aim to achieve this through restoring and expanding the woodland area, which will primarily involve controlling invasive non-native species such as Rhododendron ponticum, and through managing herbivore impact. To support this, a range of baseline survey work has been carried out during the first couple of years to assess the range and status of species and habitats currently present. So our baseline data collections covered a broad range of species. A comprehensive breeding bird survey was conducted by myself and Izzy across the reserve for the first time in 2023, which has been supplemented by data from acoustic devices known as audio moths, which was set up in with the help of SRUC. And the sound recordings can then be processed in bulk to determine the species present within a margin of accuracy. Bat surveys were also conducted in a similar manner, setting out the audio moths to record at a higher frequency. SRUC have also helped us to set up camera traps throughout the woodland, which have motion triggers and then record a section of video. And this helps us to capture evidence of what mammals are present. And the data from these has been loaded onto the citizen science platform MammalWeb, which allows members of the public to assist in identifying species on the recordings. Lower plant diversity, including lichens and mosses, were surveyed by Dr. Oliver Moore from the charity Plant Life, and fungi surveys have also been carried out last autumn by David Satori of Rewilding Mycology. Both of these surveys required specialists to carry them out and will likely be repeated in 3 to 5 years' time once the impacts of new management practices start to become evident. Soil and water samples have been taken for environmental DNA or eDNA analysis by the company Nature Metrics. This involves using DNA profiling to identify species from fragments of DNA in the sample. And with several of these surveys, such as the eDNA and the audio moth processing, we plan to store the raw data long term. This is giving us the potential to reanalyze it in the future, and means that any future data collected can be analysed in the same way and we can compare like with like. whilst taking advantage of advances in the technology and techniques that become available. And finally, we'll be monitoring woodland habitat condition, including conductive invasive species surveys and herbivore impact assessments. So the key message here is that there are a lot of complex ecological interactions to consider at this site, and which we'll need to be mindful of when making any changes to management. So, for example, through monitoring both the epiphytes and the herbivore impact, we can see that although herbivore impact may be fairly high in some areas, this may actually be creating optimal conditions for lichen communities, which are internationally important to establish and thrive. So reducing browsing pressure may not be desirable in these areas. And the key will be to keep regularly monitoring and surveying so that we can be aware of how different aspects are changing in response to our management and to respond to what we observe when needed. That's me. Back to you, Julia.
Thanks. I'll just chair the Q&A. Thank you, Tasmin. Thank you, Izzy. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Thank you for putting them in there, Sandra and Louise. And Tasmin went a little bit to answer Louise's question about how significant deer exclusion is. And Izzy, I think you can probably answer that at the same time as answering Sandra's question about of that funding that you talked about, which percentage comes from each different source.
So yeah, I don't have a sort of percentage idea to hand, but the majority was through the major donor appeal and fundraising appeal, and the remainder was RSPB. We didn't have any corporate sponsorship for the purchase, or we haven't had any for the management of the reserve at Glencripesdale so far. It's really just something we've managed to tap into for our sister site, Glencripesdale. So it's just something that might be potential for us in the future. And the other question was, yes, how significant deer exclusion is. So we're not actually wanting full exclusion of deer from the reserve, because we do need an element of herbivore impact. It's really just having control of the population size and the movement of deer through the reserve. At the moment, the fences are all completely porous, and the movement from neighbouring ground and the hill ground is really significant, especially in the winter months, which can cause significant damage to trees with stripping of bark and that sort of thing. For the site, which is all designated to become in more favourable condition, the herbivore impact really needs to be reduced. And even from our point of view, we would like to see expansion of the woodland. So really having better control of the herbivore population is going to be really important for us moving forwards.
Brilliant. Thank you, Izzy. All right, there's a chance for more Q&A with all the case studies together at the end of the session. But for now, if I can ask Penelope from Highlands Rewilding to just prepare herself and get ready to present. If you want to get a feel for what it's like at Glencripesdale, I put a link in of a video that we made in 2023 with the team, so do take some time to watch that. Penelope, over to you.
Hi everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. So I'm from co-chief scientist at Highland Rewilding, and I'm going to talk a bit about Beldorney estate, which is one of the 3 estates owned and managed by Highland Rewilding. The other ones are Bunloit, which is by Loch Ness, south of Inverness, and the third one is Taviallich in Argyll. And across all of this land, we aim to enable nature recovery and community prosperity through rewilding. And there are many different definitions of rewilding out there, and our estates are relatively small compared to some areas of individuals, other estates in Scotland. Beldorney itself is about 350 hectares. So we define rewilding as providing space for natural processes to occur, and we're always keeping people in the community at the heart of what we do as well. So yeah, the next slide's about the business model. So we are a private company, and so we're aiming to make an ethical profit through what we do. And the initial funding to set the company up and purchase the land has all come through private investment. And then last year we also ran a crowdfunding event. So we have, and that's much smaller scale investors. So now we have quite a broad scale number of people sort of investing in the company, from very small scale up to the much larger scale investors, but nobody has a greater than 15% share in the company. And our overall business objectives are to establish a profitable and scalable model for rewilding, and then eventually to provide returns to the investors ethically at a 5% annualized rate over 10 years. And we're aiming to do this through a number of different revenue streams, one of which is natural capital credits. And there's a lot of uncertainty about these, particularly for biodiversity, as I'm sure most of you know, they don't really exist in Scotland yet. So there's uncertainty about putting these into any business plans. But other revenue streams include agriculture and forestry, and also an operating system service, so offering advice to other landowners in the sort of work that we're doing in data collection and managing the land in the similar way. And then of course there's ecotourism as well, because there's holiday cottages on the estates, and we've started to run tours and things. And then other much smaller scale income will be from perhaps renewable energy further down the line, and also research grants for more of the sort of research side of the work that we're doing. And yeah, as I mentioned, community engagement is really at the heart of what we're trying to do. And this has really developed over the last year. And we've quite recently published a roadmap for the process of community engagement. And this is available now on our website to download if you want to have a look in more detail about this. But we're hoping to follow this process on all of our estates. And this is most advanced at Tavialach, which, even though that was the most recently purchased estates, because there was already quite a developed community initiative there. And so it was relatively straightforward to join in with them. And we have developed a memorandum of understanding, which includes 24 objectives on how we aim to manage the estates alongside the community. But for Beldorney in particular, this is the first step is identifying the community itself, and this is through the primarily through the Glass Community Association around Beldorney and the neighbouring landowners, and initial engaging events, so inviting people to the estates for walks and talks, and also we've held a couple of evening events just to discuss the work we're doing and to get feedback and different ideas. And then the aim is to co-identify the objectives for the land management of the estates. And we've recently had some community coordinators join the team, which will be really useful for developing this further and establishing the community baseline. But this will include a range of qualitative and quantitative measures of the community engagement. And we've also recently been awarded a Ferns project, which is an 18-month project to develop joint ventures for scalable community benefits from rewilding. So this will be a really fantastic way to progress engagement with the community, and joint ventures would hopefully include things like a deer larder, potentially, or a market garden, things like that, to use the land with the community in this way. And yet we're collecting a lot of ecological data as well. So the most important step is establishing a good baseline of what we have present when we first start managing an area. And the aim is to overall to increase the biodiversity present on the estates. And on Beldorney, our sort of shorter term objectives to do this is to extend the native and riparian woodlands, because the River Deveron runs through Beldorney estate. So we're planting some more woodland along the river there, and also the same as Glencripesdale, there's a lot of browsing control, so deer management, and also restoring grassland biodiversity and carbon stores through regenerative agriculture with the small herd of cattle that are grazed across the estates. And also recently got an NRF project to create ponds and enhance the sort of wetland areas on the estate. So that would be really fantastic as well for increasing biodiversity. And so, yeah, onto the actual sort of data that we're collecting. The metrics that we're focusing on are breeding birds. So same actually as Glencripesdale. These are through breeding bird surveys walked in person by ecologists on the team, accompanied by audio moths as well for collecting the acoustic data. And then we've also done lots of work with nature metrics for DNA data. So this is through terrestrial invertebrates with malaise and pitfall traps, and also soil eDNA for soil diversity of fungi and invertebrates, and also aquatic invertebrates from eDNA as well. And then further work with looking at plant diversity and habitats, and that's just with ecologists on the ground. And other data we're collecting is bats and mammals with camera traps, and also the acoustic sensors again for the bats, and some reptiles and amphibians as well, but those are sort of not so much of the priority. Yeah, I think that comes to the end. I don't think there were any more slides after that, Julia. I think that comes to the end of what I had to say, but happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Penelope. That's brilliant. There is one that's come into the chat. Thank you, Donald, for that. Could you say a little bit more about co-developing a community baseline? What's it involve? Can you give some examples of qualitative and quantitative measures that might come out of that?
Yeah, I think there'll be a number of different measures. I think some of them will be quite straightforward, like the number of jobs offered to do with the estate, connected with the estates, the number of people living there, the number of people visiting. Yeah, but the further things will be developed that are sort of relevant for the community. So I think this will probably involve sort of taking into account what different people are interested in. So perhaps access. So how could access be improved onto the estates? Perhaps making a small car park so people can walk there easily, and with signs for different footpath routes that are there present. And so there are a number of different measures like this. And to get more sort of, there are different ways. I'm not a social scientist myself at all, but there are social scientists now working on the project, and there are lots of different metrics that these can be turned into to get a lot of information about things like this, just through asking questionnaires, but also taking more quantitative, simple measures like number of jobs and things. So hopefully that answers your question, but I think there'll be a lot more information on our website if you'd like to read more with our community engagement roadmap as well.
Thanks, Penelope. And excuse me, Phoebe's asked how Highlands Rewilding is planning to derive a return for investors. You can hand that question back over to me if you want, Penelope.
Yes, okay.
Okay, good. So I've disclosed kind of my interest in Highlands Rewilding. I'm a board director there, and the models that we have for making returns for investors through developing carbon credits through Woodland Carbon Code, Peatland Code, emerging biodiversity codes, and then through the kind of blend of business models that are able to be operated because of the types of estates that we've got. So that involves some ecotourism, some corporate retreats, some energy projects as well. So hopefully that's a quick summary for Phoebe there. Thanks, Penelope, and Rob and Leonie, get yourselves ready. You're up next. Great, thanks, Julia.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can, thanks, Rob.
Great. Okay, so I'll start and then Leonie will come in with the biodiversity data elements. So the background of the farm is that it's a 100-acre urban farm just beside the Forth within the city boundary of Edinburgh. Its history is quite interesting in that it's part of what was once the castle estate. The castle was gifted to Edinburgh by the family owned it somewhere around the 1920s, and uniquely one of the stipulations was that there must remain forever uninterrupted views from the dining room window and bedroom windows out over the sea to Cramond Island and the Forth and Fife, which meant that nobody could develop on it, nobody could build houses on it. So it's remained an agricultural holding ever since. Since then, the farmhouse has been sold on and is now up for private rent, and farmsteading has been converted to a Toby carvery. But the land remained an agricultural holding. From then up to about 2019, it has been a mix. It's been occasionally arable, occasionally used for vegetable growing. But over the last 20 or 30 years, it's largely just been sheep grazing. So it's become very degraded. The ground is largely couch grass and other weedy grasses that you'd associate with that kind of grazing. The fencing got broke down, the walls were crumbling, and the previous tenant moved off in 2019. A group of visionaries that started Edinburgh Agri-Ecological Co-op as a direct action for seeing this land empty, formed then almost immediately, I think the start of 2020, and asked the council if we could get the land and rent it from them. They said, yes, if you have a compelling business plan and if there is community support for it. So we got initial funding to do a community survey. 2,000 people took part in that survey over the initial lockdown period, and it came back something like 90% favourable with very few objections to it. So we completed the lease, got some more funding, and then at the end of 2021, we were given right to occupy while the T's and C's of the lease got finished. So we've been working the land since the start of 2022, done a lot of tree planting, a lot of infrastructure development, started off our initial community projects and started to develop the community garden. We're surrounded by the castle site, some areas of ancient woodland, small areas of ancient woodland. Obviously, the Forth is just to the north, and then we've got, apart from that, we're surrounded by golf courses and housing estates. So we've got a lot of pressure on the land from other users, primarily dog users and dog walking firms. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the funding, our primary funder is Federated Hermes, who are a global investment company. They invest in pension funds and large corporate funds. Extremely busy and extremely, they do a lot of work. Very, very large funds. I think they have about £90 billion pounds in management at the moment. We had a personal connection with one of their fund managers, and that they also have an interest in sustainability, biodiversity, carbon, for all the reasons that we are aware of, and we have become a kind of test farm for them in developing their own processes. They're interested in impact, investment, and have an understanding that just investing in buildings and things alone may not be sustainable. So they want to invest in the areas around the cities that they work in and operate in. So they've been very supportive, and we've got an agreement with them for another 2 years, which gives us our startup capital and operational costs for 2 years. The objectives that we have are to split the 100 acres evenly between biodiversity enhancement, community development, and food production. So we're very much an agroecological project, not a rewilding project, but we're trying to make as much space for nature and all those elements as we can. The main income just now comes from our market garden and CSA, which started in 2022. We've grown it in 23, and by summer this year, we expect to have 100 to 110 veg subscribers for the community supported agriculture scheme. We're also this year going to my time as farm coordinator and our new farm coordinator, Jill, who may be on the call at the moment. We are going to be spending a lot of time doing feasibility studies and investigating what are going to be the best earners for us going forward, things that we can start with by 2026, with a view to maintaining our integrity and ethics with those three main objectives. Those streams are likely to come from training, corporate events, sale of the veg. We're also going to develop a agroecological arable and grain growing project, so we can sell grain to Granton community gardeners, a local partner who will make bread with it within 2 miles of the farm. And then also to develop our community plots and community projects and partnerships as well. So on to community. Yeah, so as I said, everything we do is grounded in supporting the local community. Even the biodiversity part is about creating a space for wildlife, but also space that to the east of the farm, there are some very poor areas of Edinburgh, low on the SIMD index, where people may not be able to afford to get out of the city. So we're putting biodiverse, rich areas right on their doorstep that they can walk to. So that's incredibly important for us. And at the same time, creating this local food supply of vegetables and wheat and flour for bread makers. But also we'll look into livestock, probably chickens and maybe some other higher animals as well, to incorporate into our crop rotations and to make a fully integrated holding. So all that together, with a little bit of work that I can't go into too much detail on just now because we're still waiting for validation, it shows that the combination of what we're doing, the biodiversity, the community, and the food has a really high impact in terms of social return on investment. And we'll be willing to share that data once we have it validated, but we can't go into that right now. So far, we've had well over 1,000 volunteers coming to the farm over the past 2 years. We've got about 50 regular volunteers who come to sessions at our community garden and market garden. And I think we've got about 35 community plots in our community allotment area. And the stipulation is if you take on a community plot, you have to be a local community group. That could be an incorporated group or just a group of neighbours from the same area. As long as you're more than 5 people, you can have and come from there, you can have a plot. We're also got volunteering. We do events right throughout the year that people can come and join in, and that's all integrated together. So while we're doing the events, we're selling food, talking about biodiversity, and hopefully showing everyone that you can grow food in an ecologically sound way and continue to improve the biodiversity on the site at the same time. And going forward, we're going to investigate and build more infrastructure to make that more of a centre of excellence, if you will, for that kind of learning and engagement. And then I'll hand over to Leonie for the ecological part.
Hi everyone,
Hello.
can you hear me okay? Yeah, great, that's grand. So thank you for the opportunity, Hannah and Julia. So Lauriston Farm, Julia talked about, this thing about what do you actually do with a piece of ground? How do you frame your decision making? And Rob's talked a bit about the historical background, which is obviously really important in considering what the ecological potential of the ground is. It's 100 acres. It's in this, just on the edge of the sort of urban envelope of the city. So unlike the other two sites, there's a lot of human interest in the site. And, when we first started, the site itself is highly modified and highly degraded really by hundreds of years of agriculture. So it was a large area of semi-improved neutral grassland with one residual hedge feature and a wetland that had appeared in the 1980s in the North Field. So that's in a way what we had to play with. And then, we're considering what best to do with it. So, what habitats have you got? Are they in good condition or not? What are the neighbouring landholders? What's the land management there? What's the ecological potential? What's missing? So in the case of Lauriston Farm, definitely wetlands. All agricultural holdings would have had ponds at one time, and amphibians and aquatic invertebrates rely on that network of ponds, which has largely gone now. So there have been masses of loss of wetland habitat within agricultural landscapes. And then what are the important things on the site? So Lauriston Farm, as Rob mentioned, is right next to the SPA, Firth of Forth, and the SSSI, which is designated for the bird interest. And it was clear from the start that we had an inheritance, if you like, of the site being used by coastal waders, particularly curlews, redshanks, geese in the winter. So particularly overwintering birds that come from elsewhere, and non-breeding birds that go down to the coast, and then when the tide comes in, they look for sites to roost on, and Lauriston Farm was one of them. So Rob mentioned the consultation that we did initially, and that was one of the things that people raised from the ecological perspective, that actually this was an important site for a roost site for waders particularly. So that's kind of where we started from. And we then developed a plan for the site. So maybe the next slide, Julia, thank you. So we've created, using nature restoration funding largely, we've created a whole network of habitats. So some of these are just by withdrawing, by doing less, and some of them are by interventions. So we've created a whole network of ponds, freshwater habitat throughout the farm. So we're hoping to encourage breeding amphibians and aquatic invertebrates. We've created a kilometre of hedgerow down the east margin of the site. We've planted, as Rob said, thousands of trees, and those are trees to create woodland in the longer term, but they're also trees as part of the agricultural system. So agroforestry strips, and there'll be alley cropping in between those. So every which way with trees. And we have also considered, the future. So obviously we're working with kind of native species, but we're also trying to consider how do we adapt to climate change? Are there opportunities for new resources like sweet chestnut, for example, walnuts? So we have planted those just as a kind of gesture to the future that maybe they will reap fruit in the future. So the other habitats that we've created through NRF is a large area of wildflower meadow, and we've also grown on and planted out a lot of wildflowers in various areas, just to sort of diversify the resource in that sense. So, and we've created an orchard, which has, you know, another element of wildlife, but also food production. So we're trying to blend those two elements together. In terms of what we're monitoring, so like the other sites, we're doing breeding bird surveys. That's the standard method. And that's, you know, a human going around and, and logging data. We've also picked up on some bird species that we hadn't picked up on using other methods by webcams. So, for example, barn owls, stonechats, woodcock have all appeared on our webcams. Bat survey was a combination of passive and active monitoring, so putting up anabats, but also doing transects through, and that work will be repeated every 5 years. So we've got a very solid baseline on that. Small mammals, we haven't done comprehensive survey, but we do have webcams out, so we're picking up on small mammals that way. And we've picked up, for example, on stoat. So we have a beautiful image of a stoat with a short-tailed field vole between its jaws. We've also picked up on rats in various parts of the farm, brown rats. So although we haven't done comprehensive survey of small mammals, we're actually hoping in the future to do a comparison of the agroforestry strips compared with open fields. Ground dwelling invertebrates, we have had Napier University, 2 students doing a survey on that. Bees and butterflies, standard surveys with using the Butterfly Conservation Scotland method and the Bumblebee Conservation Society method. So that's now an annual routine being done by volunteers. And terrestrial vegetation, we have a phase 1 habitat survey, quadrat data, and that'll, you know, be repeated as we go forward. So that's really where we're at the moment, and obviously happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Leonie and Rob. Rob, there is a question for you that you might not be able to answer publicly. So if you want to answer Stephen's question directly in the chat, that might be helpful. And then Leonie, perhaps you could answer whether you're involved in any of the Ferns projects.
No, we're not.
Okay, thank you. And that was a question from Julia. Any other questions for Lauriston Farm team, or indeed Highlands Rewilding or RSPB Scotland teams as well?
I'll just come back and answer Stephen there. It is a formal validated study. It was commissioned by Federated Hermes, and the work was done by OneStone from Edinburgh. The report is finished, but we are just deciding between us and Federated Hermes how we share that and how we're going to use it. We expect to get that and be able to share the information in January at some point.
Brilliant, thank you. I didn't know whether that was public news yet. Great. Any other questions? Okay, well, any come to you in the final few minutes, pop them in the chat. Julia, over to you.
Take myself off mute first. I'll just provide just one kind of final slide of, you know, rolling all of these 3 projects together. But before I do that, I just want to thank Penelope and Izzy and Tasmin and Leonie and Rob for being here today to talk about your projects. They're fabulous projects and you guys are all doing great things, and it's so wonderful for you to share them. So thank you to all of you for being here and presenting. So here's just a few kind of the upshot of what we've learned from these projects, including some of the common challenges and themes for success. And really, there's just 3 that I want to touch on in this slide really briefly. The first is the need for flexibility. So there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to a biodiversity project. And I think it was pretty evident from just the presentation of the projects today that there are a lot of different ways that you can have a project that improves and restores biodiversity. So this means that as we kind of move forward in this space, the policy and the financial landscape needs to remain flexible to allow for a range of different projects and solutions that assist us in the conservation and recovery of biodiversity. So despite the range of projects and their differences, I think one of the commonalities that we saw here is the reliance on a range of public and private sources of money to fund the first couple of years of each project, and the need to have to piece together a diversity of revenue streams and funding mechanisms to continue the projects into the future. So this all makes an argument for the need to really remain flexible in how we think of how we're funding and how we're moving forward biodiversity projects, and keeping space for a wide variety of solutions to help us with the biodiversity restoration. The second piece is really looking at a need for evidence-based conservation planning. So we've seen in these projects that this really starts with a vision and an understanding of what success means. So setting really good goals and objectives and following that up with, what to measure, how to measure it, and understanding, using that data to understand what actions are going to lead to success. So for example, we need good measurement and data to understand the actions and activities that are going to result in the biodiversity gains that we're aiming to achieve in a project. And we need good reference knowledge to set the right targets. Equally important is being able to report out on and communicate all of this to interested parties, funders, and investors. And then I think the last piece that's really critical is the need for resources. So it is not possible to do more with less. And I think each of these projects really benefited from having dedicated funding for the initial phase of the project baselining and the project planning. But having enough resources, both in people's time and in the materials, it was still a common challenge. There needs to be funding to adequately resource conservation and restoration projects. And this doesn't just mean funding for the work itself, but it also means investing in good data collection. It means investing in training and skills development, project management, and also the technical and non-technical communication of project outcomes. So that's kind of the upshot, I think, of some of the key elements that we've seen, and I'll turn it over to Hannah.
Thanks, everyone. So this is just the last couple of minutes on where we go next. The Anarchaea project that we've run has been part of a bigger program called Integrating Finance and Biodiversity, and that has been funded by NERC, the Natural Environment Research Council, for another phase of work between January 24 and March 26. The outcomes of all the 12 different projects that have been in phase one are at infinbio.org, so do look that up if you're interested. The next phase, all the projects are going to be working together, so we're more clustered around these flagship projects, which are the big circles: financing green sector transitions, greening portfolios, and financing biodiversity. So we hope that some of our work will continue in that financing biodiversity flagship, and we're also running a part of the hub around international coordination and UK coordination around biodiversity and finance as well. And we're really thrilled to be working in partnership with the Green Finance Institute and their group for financial institutions interested in nature, GFIN. So thank you everybody for learning with us. We hope that you have some recipes for recovery to take away. We hope you enjoy the watch list and that you've enjoyed listening to the case studies. Thanks Tasmin and Izzy, Penelope, Rob and Leonie, and my team, Julia and Jules from Scottish Nature Finance Pioneers. And thank you to you all for coming and listening and participating. So it's 1 minute to 1. Your lunch and learn is done and dusted. I hope your tummies are rumbling. Thanks a lot and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah.